I always trusted my wife until I discovered her secret date with her lover. It happened when she asked me to pick up the kids while she needed to make a phone call, but I decided to follow her. I saw her at the very same hotel she often mentioned as a place for work meetings. Seeking revenge, I decided to take back control. What I did next shocked even her. Will my revenge be the final straw for our marriage? Watch until the end. What if your suspicions turn into a terrifying reality? What do you do when everything you believe to be true begins to fall apart? Ross didn't know the answers to these questions. All he felt was bitterness and fear consuming him as he desperately searched for an explanation for what was happening in his life. Ross woke up every morning to a silence that no longer felt peaceful. Sydney, his wife, worked in the university cafeteria, and while they didn't spend much time together, he had always felt her presence. She was his support, the one he could turn to when life threw challenges his way. But the longer he lived with her, the more he started noticing strange changes in her behavior. She began spending more time with students, especially with some of the young men who frequented the cafeteria, and he couldn't understand why it bothered him so much. At first, it seemed like normal, friendly conversations. But gradually, it became something more than just a casual exchange of words or glances. One day, he came home earlier than usual and stumbled upon Sydney talking on the phone in another room. Her voice was hushed, and though he couldn't hear who she was speaking to, there was something in her tone that made him uneasy. What kind of conversation is this? He wondered, but chose not to invade her privacy. That evening, he said nothing, but he felt his suspicions beginning to take root. Days passed, and Ross started noticing more and more odd moments that previously seemed insignificant. One of the students, Jason, seemed particularly close to Sydney. He often stayed behind after lunch to help her clean up, and other students laughed and joked that it was a special time for the couple. Everyone laughed, but Ross felt something different, an unexplainable tension. Why was this student always around? Why did they laugh in a way that was different from how she laughed with others? These questions haunted him. One day, while sitting in the library, one of his colleagues, Mike, approached him. Without much hesitation, Mike started saying something that would change everything. "I saw your wife in the park last night," Mike said with a strange look in his eyes. "She was kissing Jason. I just can't believe what I saw." Ross froze in place. He couldn't believe his ears. This couldn't be true. Sydney, his wife of 5 years. How could she do something like that? "Are you sure?" he asked, trying to suppress his panic. "I'm not guessing. I saw it, and it looked very intimate." Mike's words echoed in his mind, but Ross couldn't bring himself to believe them. No matter how painful it was, he had to see for himself. He tried to act normal, but every time he sat with Sydney, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She had become more distant, spending more time with people he didn't know. This wasn't normal for them. He tried talking to her about it, but she just laughed, saying he was being paranoid. "You're just stressed from work, Ross," she said, smiling. "It's nothing serious." But he knew it wasn't just work stress. Something had changed in her, and it was more than just work-related pressure. And then, one day, when he came home early from work, he saw something that confirmed his worst fears. Through an open window, he saw Sydney kissing another girl, a student from the university. It was more than he could handle. Now he knew. She was cheating on him. His heart pounded. He couldn't breathe. Everything he had kept bottled up inside suddenly exploded. How had he not noticed this sooner? How could she be so shameless? He had no words. He closed the window and made a decision that would change everything. "I know what you did, Sydney," he said when she came home. Her face was calm, but he saw her eyes widen slightly. "How did you find out?" she asked quietly, as if she had already been expecting this moment. He felt his blood boiling, but tried to stay composed. "I know everything," he replied firmly, "and I've decided. I won't just sit back and take this." Those words marked the beginning of the end of their marriage. He didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain. He would not let her continue betraying him in the shadows. What happens when the truth comes to the surface, and what once seemed invisible becomes visible in the most painful way? What if every step leads to something you can never undo? Sydney remained silent when Ross told her he knew everything. Her face froze as if she had been expecting this moment, Yet at the same time, she was desperately trying to find a way to keep at least some of her secrets. She couldn't believe he had figured it all out. How could you? Her voice was low, carrying a hint of disappointment she was trying to conceal. I couldn't ignore it, Ross replied coldly, trying to keep his composure, even though he felt a storm raging inside him. I saw you kissing them. First Jason, then that girl. You're not even trying to hide it anymore. Sydney looked away as if searching for an escape from the situation she had created herself. Every movement, every glance of hers was difficult and painful to watch. Ross, I don't know what to say. I love you. Love? He laughed, but his laughter was bitter, lifeless. You love me? You can't even be honest with me. How is that possible? I don't know what happened to me. Everything is so confusing. I couldn't resist. They gave me what I was missing from you. And what exactly didn't I give you? His voice was now as cold as ice. We lived together. We were building our life together. You knew I was working, giving my soul to what I do. I thought we were everything we needed. She lowered her head, realizing that everything was already lost. Her words became empty, and all that remained was the face of her husband, who no longer believed in her promises. Ross, I understand that you can't forgive this, but I really want us to fix things. I will make it right. He wiped his face with his palm, closing his eyes. He knew that everything she said no longer mattered. It was over. And even though the pain in his heart was unbearable, he knew he had to end this story. This can't be fixed, Sydney. You can't manipulate me anymore. And you won't keep hiding your betrayal under the mask of love. This is the end. She started crying, her eyes filled with tears. But Ross was not inclined to pity. He knew this was just another manipulation, another attempt to make him forgive her. And he no longer had the desire to fall for her charm. As Sydney fell to her knees, begging for a second chance, Ross felt himself distancing from her internally. He felt his heart turning to stone. She didn't deserve his forgiveness. She didn't deserve any chance. You made your choice, Sydney, and now I have to make mine. His words were as firm as iron. He walked out of the room, leaving her alone in their house, which was no longer a home to him. Days passed, and Ross couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Sydney kept trying to convince him to give her another chance, but he remained unwavering. He no longer trusted her, and with every passing day, he felt their connection fading away. But soon, he learned that her betrayal was only part of a bigger game. One day, on his way home from the university, Ross received a message on his phone. It was a photograph. In the picture, Sydney was sitting at a cafe table, and with her was not only Jason but also another person, her former classmate, whom Ross knew. This wasn't just another student. This was a man Sydney had been involved with before she and Ross met. The photo hit him like a cold shower. He couldn't believe what he was seeing, but there was no doubt this was another twist in their story. And now, he had to take another step. Now he understood that her betrayal wasn't just an accident or a mistake. It was part of her game, and he had been her victim. But this couldn't go on any longer. Feeling the urgency to act fast, he decided he didn't want to stay trapped in this any longer. The next day, after Sydney returned from work, Ross was ready for the final move. He did it, packed his things and left. She could no longer manipulate him, and this time, she had no chance. You don't know what you're losing, Ross, she said as he stood at the doorstep. I already know everything, Sydney, he replied, opening the door. You lost me a long time ago. She looked at him, but she couldn't hold back her tears. All her manipulations, all her attempts to repair the relationship were in vain. He had made his choice, and now he had to move forward. What if the truth you're searching for is actually waiting for you, and it's not what you expected? What happens when a single look at the world changes your life forever? He didn't come back. Ross didn't show up that evening, and the next day, he was absent from the university. Sydney realized that all her efforts had been in vain. He was gone, and this time, she understood that she wouldn't be able to bring him back. Every step, every word she said no longer mattered to him. She simply couldn't grasp how and why he had left so easily. It was a blow from which there was no recovery. 3 days passed, and her life felt empty. All those affairs with other guys, even that thing with the girl, no longer made sense. She realized that she had lost a real man. And no matter how hard she tried to convince herself otherwise, the guilt remained, refusing to fade away. And just when she was about to give up, something happened that made her heart race again. A few calls, a few messages from him. Texts filled her phone once more. But they weren't like before. They were brief, direct, as if Ross had no time to waste on words. He had set a meeting, and when she arrived, she saw him. "I can't be with you," he said without looking at her. "But you need to know that this isn't what you expect." She stood there, not believing her ears, but his gaze was resolute. It felt surreal, like a cold shower that led to a deep emptiness inside her. "Are you trying to manipulate me again?" Her voice turned aggressive, her heart pounding in her chest. "What do you want? For me to lose my mind over your games again?" "No, Sydney," he replied, his voice calm and cold. "This isn't a game. You've already lost." He pulled a package from his pocket and placed it on the table before her. She couldn't understand what it was. It wasn't just a letter or a photograph. It was someone's information, but not just any information. "What is this?" Her voice trembled. "It's something you need to see. It's about your new friends, and about how far you've gone." She opened the package and saw letters, printed out chats, and photos that seemed eerily familiar. The same students she had seen sitting in the university. The same guys and girls she had engaged with in her romantic affairs. Every detail was documented, as if someone had been tracking her every move. She was shocked. This was part of a larger game in which she could no longer consider herself a player. "Who did this?" she asked, barely holding back the panic creeping in. "You made these choices yourself. I just want you to know the truth," he said, sitting across from her. "You think this is just my revenge for your betrayal, but that's not it. I want you to realize how deep you've sunk into all of this. I want you to feel what I felt when I found out about your affairs." She felt her heart clench. Someone had been watching her. She couldn't believe it. And how did this package end up in Ross's hands? How did he find all of this out? "You can't be this," her voice weakened, knowing she wouldn't win in this situation. "Oh, Sydney, I just want you to understand. I'm not just leaving you. I'm giving you a chance, but on my terms. You have an opportunity to fix what you've done. You can choose what to do next. But now, it's your decision, not mine." Sydney looked at him, and though she knew this couldn't be the end of her story, she realized that this moment would change her forever. Only now did she begin to understand that her affairs and manipulations would no longer lead anywhere. Everything she had done had become part of a bigger scheme, and every step she took from now on would be final. Ross had made it clear. He only cared about one thing now: her complete severance from all those who had stood between them. And if she didn't understand that, she would lose everything. Ross stood up, clenching his fingers. This was the moment she had to decide whether she was ready to face the full consequences of her actions. "You have to decide. And whatever choice you make, Sydney, I won't change it." He walked out of the room, leaving her in silence. What if you truly want to apologize, but end up ruining everything again? What if the truth you're trying to hide becomes your downfall? And are you ready to lose everything once more just to see them play with your life? The day passed slowly. Sydney sat at home, staring at the empty table. What was she supposed to do? Should she take everything Ross had given her and move forward? She realized that her affairs weren't just part of her life anymore. They felt like forgotten stories. She knew she could no longer hide from this. And yet, something held her in place. She still couldn't accept the reality that Ross was right. That evening, as she was heading home, her phone lit up with a few more messages from the same student she had been talking to before. Another invitation to meet. She tried to ignore it, but deep inside, something had already started shifting in another direction. That evening, she met with him again. But this time, things didn't go as she had planned. She was late, having just left the university, and then, without paying attention, she walked into the restaurant where he was waiting for her. When Sydney saw him, her heart sped up. He was sitting at the table, his gaze lively, full of passion. He pointed to the chair across from him. "Hi." His voice sounded as if they had known each other for a long time. She didn't respond immediately. Her head was filled with thoughts, but she didn't know if she should continue this relationship. And yet, she couldn't refuse. They started talking, laughing, and at times, Their gazes grew deeper. That evening, what had once started as an innocent conversation turned into an uncontrollable desire, and she fell into the trap again. But what happened later made her heart shatter. When Sydney returned home that evening, she was overwhelmed with emotions. All these feelings consuming her had become a heavy burden. She was living two lives and could no longer separate one truth from another. But when she stepped into the apartment, everything changed. Meanwhile, Ross was at home. He sat quietly on the couch, lost in thought. He couldn't understand why she was acting this way. Just a few days ago, he had tried to forgive her. But deep down, he felt that he could never trust her again. When Sydney opened the door, her expression was like that of a zombie. She was no longer the woman she once was. It seemed like she had lost herself. But what happened next was something she never expected. The moment she stepped inside, another man stood before her. He was tall, with dark hair, and looked as if he had been waiting for her for a long time. "Are you serious?" She felt something inside her snap. The man looked at her again, but this time, his gaze wasn't as friendly. It was something else, Wild. He was no longer just an old friend from university. He was a part of her mistake. "What do you want from me?" Sydney asked, trying to hide her anxiety. The man lifted his gaze and laughed. He emphasized every word. "Don't you get it, Sydney? This isn't just about your affairs. You've lost everything, and now you're going to pay for it." Sydney started to realize that things went much deeper than she had thought. She was just a piece of something bigger. But as she kept diving into her chaotic world, she didn't even notice how she had become the center of this game once again. And then, again, the feeling of pain. She saw the man stepping closer, placing a hand on her shoulder. And then, like lightning, she heard Ross's voice. "What are you doing?" His question was cold, like ice water. Sydney couldn't believe her eyes. He was standing there, in the doorway, looking at her. And that look, it was full of rage. "Ross, you don't understand." Her voice trembled with fear. But he only gave her one look, one that completely broke her. And then, without another word, he turned and left them. Sydney was left alone. The man from the university disappeared again. And even if she had tried to fix her relationship with him, it was clear she had lost everything. Now she understood that her desires, her manipulations, her affairs, and betrayals had led her to this moment. And all that remained was constant loneliness and the loss of what she once had. She couldn't take anything back, but Ross was gone. And even if she forgave herself, it would already be too late. What will you do when you realize for the first time that you haven't just betrayed the person you love, but also yourself? What will you do when the truth you tried to hide stands right in front of you, and there's nothing left to change? Sydney sat on the bed, her hands clenched into fists, trying to calm her racing heart. Voices echoed in her head. Ross, the man with whom she had shared so many years, and that mysterious man from the university who had become part of her dark affairs. She tried to find answers. How did this happen? How did she end up in this situation? How had her life, once carefree, become filled with pain, betrayal, and loss? But the biggest question was, could she change anything? The sudden sound of a door opening broke the silence. Sydney jumped and turned around. It was Ross. He stood in the doorway, seemingly unchanged. But his eyes, they were no longer the same. They no longer held the tenderness they once did. Now, they burned with anger, disappointment, but also a touch of indifference, something she couldn't understand. "You're with him again, Sydney?" His voice was low, but with a coldness worse than any insult. It was more than disappointment. It was destruction. She stood in silence, not knowing what to say. What could she possibly say after everything that had happened? She had lost faith in herself and was unable to explain her choices. "Ross, She tried to say something, but her voice broke, and she could only watch as he stepped closer, her heart tightening with pain. He didn't let her finish. "Don't," he said. "I've seen everything I needed to see." A few days ago, after she left to meet with a guy from the university, he had overheard a conversation among students. One of them said he had seen Sydney kissing a male student, and that their meeting had been far too passionate to be just a friendly chat. Another student mentioned seeing her kissing a girl at an event. These words, though indirect, immediately ignited a chain of doubts within him. But what sealed it was the moment he overheard her phone conversation with that same man. She didn't know he was listening and spoke about something that was clearly meant to be a secret. "Don't you see that you're destroying everything around you?" His voice was rising, almost to a shout. "I don't even care why this happened anymore. But I can't live like this." Sydney felt her heart sinking. She understood that she had lost him, forever. But this wasn't the end yet. Now she needed to figure out what she wanted for herself. "And now what?" she asked quietly, looking into his eyes. "Do you want me to just leave?" He didn't answer right away. His gaze was sad and heavy. It seemed like he was searching for the right words, but couldn't find them. "You want me to punish you, don't you?" he added after a pause, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had reached his breaking point. "But you've already punished yourself, Sydney." She felt her old life slowly crumbling. But what could she do? How could she go back? How could she regain his trust, and her own? At that moment, the door opened, and another man stepped into the room. The same guy from the university she had been secretly meeting. He was calm, but his eyes still held the same passion she had felt the first time. "Ross, I know this is hard," he said, stopping at the doorway. "But you need to understand that this was much more complicated than you think. It's not just about Sydney." Sydney couldn't believe her ears. What did he mean? She was tangled in her emotions, but she couldn't say anything anymore. "What do you mean?" she asked, turning to him. "She was pulled into a game you don't understand, Ross," the man continued. "She wasn't just unfaithful. She was part of something bigger. Maybe you'll never fully grasp it. But if you want, I can explain." Everything inside Sydney froze at that moment. She looked at the man, then at Ross. Her world was falling apart, and this man didn't seem to be the one bringing her peace. "Fine, I'm willing to listen," she surrendered. What else was there to do? She could no longer be part of this game. But what began the next day changed everything. It was only the start of an even greater intrigue, one that would escalate. When you learn more than you can handle, and what once seemed black and white suddenly turns gray, will it be your salvation or your ultimate downfall? Sydney sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clenching into fists again. She heard footsteps in the hallway. It was Ross. She knew he would come back, but now everything felt so uncertain. Could she fix this? Did she even have the right to hope for forgiveness? But when he stepped into the room, her heart nearly stopped. His expression had changed, not just anger or resentment, but a certain indifference that silently spoke of the end. Yet something in him was different. He was no longer the man she had shared her life with. "Sydney," he said barely above a whisper, "I don't know what to do. Everything I've seen and everything I've been told is just unbearable." She felt a crushing pain in her chest. What she had done was beyond repair. She loved him, but there was something dark inside her, and that darkness was consuming her more and more. "Ross, she tried to say something, but he cut her off. "You're still with him, Sydney," he said, bitterness lacing his voice. "You're not even trying to hide it anymore. But do you know what's worse? You don't realize how many times you've betrayed me, not just physically, but emotionally. And I have no strength left to fight." He took a step back, and her heart pounded faster when she saw the phone in his hand. He was just a few steps away from her, but at that moment, every step felt impossibly long. Her gaze locked onto the phone, and she instantly realized he had found something. And it was more than just proof of her infidelity. "I got this message a few minutes ago," Ross said, irony dripping from his voice. "You have no idea who that man you've been seeing really is." Sydney tried to hide her fear, but it was futile. He showed her the phone screen, where a message from an unknown number had appeared. It read, "I know your secret, and it's not just about you. If you want to get out of this alive, tell her that the real plan has begun, and now it's impossible to stop." "What does this mean, Ross?" Her voice trembled, but she tried to stay composed. He didn't answer. He simply placed the phone on the table quietly and looked at her. This wasn't just a message about her betrayal. It was something more. It was a threat. "Did you think this was all there was between us?" he asked, tilting his head. "You have no idea what really happened. You didn't just destroy our relationship. This is much worse." Her mind couldn't fully grasp what he was saying. She had already prepared herself to lose everything, But now, an entirely different reality unfolded before her. She looked at him, and her heart felt like it was shattering. "What do you mean?" she asked again, barely believing her own words. He stood up, silently took the phone from the table, and slowly walked toward the door. She couldn't understand what had just happened. What was that message? Who was this man? And why did he seem so familiar? But when he turned back, she saw something in his expression. It wasn't just pain, it was fear. And then she realized that what he had said was only a small part of something much bigger. He hadn't just lost faith in her. He had become entangled in something very dark. "Sydney, I don't want to lose you. But I know this isn't just a game. I know you've been pulled into something far beyond mere betrayal." She stared at him in confusion, not understanding what he meant. But when she saw him pull another phone from his pocket and open a message, her heart began to race. This time, the message was addressed to her. "You're already in too deep. Remember, not all traitors pay for their actions the same way. We know everything about you and your husband." Sydney felt her blood freeze. She was no longer sure why this was happening. But she knew one thing. Her life now felt like a true nightmare, and there was no way out. "This isn't just about you and me, Sydney. This is about the fact that we've become part of something bigger. And now we have to make a choice," Ross said, his voice serious. "Do you want to walk away from all this and try to find salvation? Do you want to know what's really behind all of this?" She lifted her gaze, her eyes meeting his once again, and in that moment, she felt that everything they had been through might just be the beginning of an even greater storm that was only starting to form. The answer was no longer simple. What if Ross's worst fears were only just beginning to come true, and he hadn't just become a victim of betrayal but a part of something even bigger and mortally dangerous? Sydney sat on the bed, her gaze empty, her mind circling one question. What was happening? What did all of this mean? And why did Ross look so broken? Why had his fear become so real and threatening? She still couldn't understand why her infidelity now seemed like a part of a much larger game, where the stakes were higher than she had ever imagined. "Ross, do you respect me?" Her voice was ragged with unspoken pain, but she tried to keep her composure. "What do you even want from me?" He sat down on the chair beside her, not taking his eyes off her, but he didn't answer right away. In his gaze, there was more than just disappointment. There was uncertainty, fear, and bitterness. He looked like a man trapped in a cage of his own making. "I don't know why this happened, Sydney," he said quietly, exhaustion heavy in his voice. "I don't understand why all of this has become so irreversible." She looked at him, and his words stirred a sense of helplessness within her again. What did he mean? Why was this so deep? She had suspected for a long time that something was off, but now, when everything had come to light, when Ross began speaking of his suspicions, she felt as if her life was crumbling into pieces. "We can't go back," she whispered, lowering her head. "We've destroyed everything we had." Only now did Sydney realize that she had truly lost everything, but her mind refused to fully accept it. How could one lose everything and not even realize that it had already happened? "I don't know what to do." Ross lifted his head, his gaze clouded with despair. "It feels like this isn't just about us anymore. This is getting worse, Sydney." At that moment, she heard something faintly buzzing from her phone. Instinctively, she checked the screen, but all she saw was another unknown message. "You are on the edge of everything. We've already seen you with him. There's no turning back now. Come back to us, Sydney." She knew these words weren't just a threat. They were a summons. Something deeper than her betrayal stood behind them. "What is it?" Ross asked, noticing how her fingers trembled as she held the phone. "It's them," she whispered, unsure of how to say it out loud. "They know everything, Ross. They're not just watching me. They're watching both of us." Those words made everything feel even more surreal. Ross realized that what he had suspected was only the tip of the iceberg. All those mysterious messages, his fears that Sydney was part of something bigger than just infidelity, now it all became clear and undeniable. "You have to tell me more, Sydney." His voice became sharp, even desperate. "Who are these people? Why do they know everything about us so perfectly?" Sydney looked at him, her eyes devoid of tears. Only emptiness remained. She couldn't believe she had actually been pulled into such a game. that her decision to put herself in the hands of dark forces now had such dire consequences. "It's not just them," she said, trying to pull herself together. "These are groups that manipulate people. They find individuals who can be useful for their purposes. I didn't even know I was caught up in this, Ross. I thought it was just a coincidence, but now I see it wasn't." Her words immediately created a new wave of anxiety in Ross's heart. Now everything made sense, and everything he had known before became meaningless. Sydney was part of a bigger plan, and that was terrifying. "But why you, Sydney?" His voice was filled with disappointment and pain. "It wasn't enough for you just to betray me, but you became part of something like this?" She sighed, feeling her heartbeat quicken. She could no longer hide what she was feeling. "I didn't know where I was going, Ross," she whispered, looking into his eyes. "I thought I could control everything, but it turned out I became part of a dark game with no way back." And at that moment, she realized her life was no longer her own. The forces guiding her had become too powerful to escape. They had a plan, and now she was just a piece on their chessboard. "How do we get out of this, Sydney?" Ross asked, for the first time in a long while, his voice carrying desperation. She lifted her head and met his gaze. Now it was different, filled with fear, but also an unconscious desire to understand what had happened and, perhaps, to fix it. "I don't know, Ross. But one thing I do know. We can't live as we did before. This is no longer just about our relationship. We're caught up in something we can't handle alone." And this was only the beginning. Now, they had to make a choice. Stay together and untangle this mess, or run to save at least a part of their souls. But what if Ross discovered that everything he believed in was a lie, and that Sydney was not just a victim but an active participant in the dark game behind it all? Ross sat at the table, staring at Sydney, unable to believe his eyes. Everything he had known, everything he had believed in, suddenly felt so powerless. The messages she had received, the talks about groups, manipulation, all of it now made sense, and he was caught in something far worse than just infidelity. "You're back in the game, aren't you?" His voice was strained. "Sydney, tell me, why are you doing all this? Do you just want to win? Or do you really not see that your actions could destroy not only us but everything we had?" She sat across from him, her hands nervously clenched on her lap. Her gaze was different now. He no longer saw the softness and love he once felt in her eyes. Now, he saw a person so deeply entangled in the game that there was no way back. "You don't understand, Ross," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. "This isn't about us. It's about something bigger. I've become part of something that you can't just walk away from." "What do you mean?" he asked, both frustrated and confused. "I thought you loved me, that you cared about us." "I don't know what's happening," she shuddered. "I can't control it. This isn't just my fight. They control everything, and I'm just a piece of their plan." Inside, Ross felt everything turning upside down. It was hard for him to believe that the Sydney he lived with had a secret world he had never even suspected. But now he was witnessing that she had fallen into the hands of some mysterious people he couldn't understand. "You don't know what it was like." Her voice turned firm, but doubt still flickered in her eyes. "They want me, they want you. They use everything to make us submit." "Who are they, Sydney?" Ross could no longer stand this uncertainty. "Who are these people? What do they want from us? Why didn't you tell me all this earlier?" "I was afraid you wouldn't understand," she lowered her voice. "Maybe I didn't even understand it myself. I wanted you not to believe in it. But everything has changed." Now, Ross had a serious suspicion. He was not just a victim of betrayal. He had become part of a bigger and far more complicated game. And now, he was dealing with someone who wasn't just a victim. Sydney was part of this dark world. "You said these people wouldn't harm you, that they just manipulate others to make them do their bidding. So what? Am I just a piece on their chessboard?" "I was a piece too," she whispered, her gaze growing heavy. "But now everything has changed. I can't leave this anymore. They control everything, even your actions. Do you want me to be part of this, Sydney?" His voice turned angry. "Do you want me to be with them, to stand by your side in this dark story?" She lowered her head. Her silence spoke louder than any words. "You're already in the game." Her words struck his soul like a hammer. "You can't just walk away from this." And at that moment, Ross realized this was only the beginning. He had become part of a grand scheme, and getting out of it was far more complicated than he could have ever imagined. "This isn't just a game," she said, lifting her eyes to meet his. "This is what they want. They want both of us, and we can't just escape." She stood up and walked to the window, staring into the darkness. She wasn't just the woman he loved. She was part of something much bigger, and now that everything was out in the open, he knew his life would never be the same. "What do we do?" he asked, realizing his life was no longer his own. She stood by the window, unmoving. In that moment, he understood that her words weren't just an attempt at an apology, they were a call to arms. "We have no choice," she said, her voice heavy with tension. "We have to follow them. Right now, it's the only way." Sydney's gaze turned cold, and Ross felt himself sinking deeper into the trap with every second. Now, he had a choice. Either go with her or lose everything that was left. He took a step forward, but as soon as his hand reached her shoulder, she turned to him with a smile. But it wasn't just any smile. It was a smile that told him he wasn't just meant to be part of her life. He was meant to be part of her dark world. What if everything Ross believed was a lie? What if Sydney wasn't just betraying him but was playing an even crueler game than he could ever imagine? And the more he dug, the deeper he fell into a world where there was no way out. Ross stood by the window, staring at the city lights. His heart was racing. He felt as if he was standing at the edge of an abyss, and the only way forward was to leap into the unknown. His gaze shifted back to Sydney. She sat on the couch, her face calm, but her eyes. There was something in her eyes he couldn't quite understand, as if she knew more than he could ever imagine, as if everything happening was already part of her plan. "You didn't answer my question," Ross said, breaking the silence. Sydney didn't reply right away. She walked to the table, picked up a cup of coffee, and stared into it thoughtfully. "You're thinking about leaving me again, aren't you? You still believe that's the only way, don't you?" Her voice was calm, but Ross could sense the deception in it. "I think you betrayed me," he said through clenched teeth. "And I think you're manipulating me, trying to drag me into some damn game I don't want to play." Sydney lifted her gaze. There wasn't just coldness in her eyes. There was something else, something terrifying that made his heart tighten. "You can't just walk away from this, Ross," she said quietly. "This isn't a game. This is life, and you're already in it. You're as much a part of this story as I am." Her words made him pause. He wasn't just a victim of her betrayal. He had become part of something much bigger than he ever thought possible. And now, he had to make a choice. "If I could just forget everything, I would," he said, struggling to keep his emotions in check. "If I could go back and unsee how you manipulate me, I would. But you're not giving me that choice." Sydney stood before him, her gaze turning colder, her voice growing sharper. "Do you really think everything that happened was just a coincidence?" she asked, stepping closer to him. "They've been watching you. They knew you would find out. But don't you think it's already too late?" His heart pounded harder. He felt the ground trembling beneath his feet. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. This was about something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface of ordinary life. "Who are they?" he whispered. Sydney hesitated for a moment, as if debating whether to tell him. And then, suddenly, her eyes gleamed with an eerie light. "They're the ones who came for us," she said coldly. "And we can't escape. You're already in their trap, Ross. And so am I." Something in the air shifted. Ross felt his hands begin to tremble. His mind struggled to process what she had just said. This wasn't just betrayal. This was part of a much bigger plan, and he was already inside it. "I'm not going to be part of their game," he said, feeling his anger start to take over. "You're already part of this game, Ross," Sydney replied, her voice turning cold and sharp. "And I know you don't want to admit it, but you can't leave." Only at that moment did Ross realize that everything he had done and tried to do didn't matter. He was trapped, and now he had only one path: to follow Sydney or let everything play out to the end. He took a step back, ready to stand up and leave. But suddenly, the door swung open, and another person appeared on the threshold. It wasn't one of his colleagues. It was a man he had only seen a few times, James. James looked at him with a mysterious smile, and Ross immediately knew something was wrong. You still haven't realized that we've been watching you for a long time, have you? James said, stepping into the room. What do you mean? Ross asked, feeling his heart skip a beat. We knew you'd figure everything out, James said, moving closer. You were supposed to choose the right side. But you chose Sydney, and now you're with us. There is no choice. Sydney stood silently, her eyes once again cold and distant. This was part of her plan, and now Ross could do nothing to change it. He no longer had control over the situation. What do you want from me? He asked, but his voice already sounded like a farewell to any hope. You already know what we want, James said, stepping even closer. You are one of us now, and you can't escape. The entire reality he believed in shattered into pieces. Sydney, James, and all those people who promised him the truth had now become part of a larger, more terrifying game, and Ross had no way out of this labyrinth. In that moment, he understood. He had only one option left, either accept the new reality or leave everything behind and not know what lies beyond the next step. Would Ross be ready to sacrifice his beliefs to uncover the whole truth, or would he crack under pressure and become part of the dark world he had found himself in?